Shalom, brothers and sisters. Shalom, brothers and sisters. Giving honor to the Most High, the Creator and the Maker of heaven and earth. This presentation is in due honor on a human level to the people who were taken as captives from Western Africa and in part Eastern Africa, but mainly Western Africa, and brought over here to the Western Hemisphere. Wanted to say, as a quote said, Black man, what I have found recently within the say 2 or so years, speaking upon this subject, it has brought people who agreed and people who disagreed. What I disagreed is when people will try to tell you, whoever you may be, to try to talk about another's enslavement, to talk about, for instance, the enslavement of the indigenous people of the Americas, which is not to be denied, but that's not the topic at hand. The situation of Bartolome Las Casas, brothers and sisters, is not the main subject at hand in this particular presentation. When, for instance, the people speak about the Japanese enslaving the Chinese, the aspect, brothers and sisters, of the treaty between America and Spain of 1795 in the Atlantic slave trade is not mentioned, because in that particular case, it has nothing to do with that. During the Vietnam War, brothers and sisters, there were Black men that were told to not be involved in that war. Did you know that? During the era, brothers and sisters, when in the 1940s, when Japan was being attacked during the era of World War II by the Americans, the Japanese people in the United States was put in concentration camps. Yet, once it came down to said Black people, when Grenada and Panama in the 1980s were attacked, they knew Black people in general are not united, so there's no reason for them to have to put Black people inside of a concentration camp in that particular case, because they already knew we were concentrated to be within the camp in our own mind, that we will not go up and do anything of a seditious nature. Now, we are not teaching, brothers and sisters, to be of a seditious nature. All right. So that's something we want to talk about for reference purposes. What I want to state as well, brothers and sisters, is it became painstakingly obvious that people wanted to control how Black people, said Black people, speak upon slavery. In many cases, I remember, say like last year before the said pandemic had came in and so forth and so on, in 2019, when speaking about the Atlantic slave trade going west, there were people saying, we were here already. We were here already. When you say we were here, who was we? What is our name? And where exactly is here? Because we cannot, and when I say we, I'm talking about said Black people, cannot lay claim to the caves of Europe, no more than can we lay claim to, say, North and South Dakota, where the snow is much more higher in many cases. There's a teaching that says that all original nations of the earth were what you'll call Black, and that there were people who migrated to Europe and they became lighter in hue as time went on, and their physical characteristics began to match up with the climates. If that is the case, let's say that is true, that teaching and understanding, that would mean that if we were here, as in North America, then we would not be looking the same way as most of us who are listening to this, or as myself or so. You understand? Just wanted to point that out. Now, brothers and sisters, this particular video called slavery, 1600 to 1900. We have asked, brothers and sisters, that the date given as 1619, right? If we will, that is when a Dutch man of war brought black people as slaves to Virginia, in Jamestown, Virginia. Brothers and sisters, was a colony of the British in 1607. So from 1607 until 1776, '07 through 1776 is colonial America. Slavery existed, brothers and sisters, in colonial America. That is not denied by any scholar. The indigenous people of the land here were enslaved. That is not denied by anybody worth their grain of salt, if we will. Brothers and sisters, there were people taken from the Western Hemisphere and were shipped over to Europe as slaves. Christopher Columbus, and before him, you had Amerigo Vespucci who did such. That is not denied by said scholars. You had the indigenous people, quote unquote Indians, that were given smallpox by the Europeans. That is not denied by said scholars. However, it seems to be the case when the said black man talks about this particular subject, many people are quick to say, "We were here already. Oh, you should talk about this. You should talk about the situation with the Quisqueya and what you call the Dominican Republic and the Taino and what you call in the place of Puerto Rico." That's not denied by scholars, but that's not the subject and the main point at hand, brothers and sisters. Because when other nations speak upon the situations of history, be it their own or others, they stay in line in what they're talking about. But it seems that the black man is geared to be out of line and out of place of what he or she, in this case, black man or black woman, is presenting in such case. That is why authorship becomes important. Because once you'll be able to sit there and get your own information that you gathered on paper and then have it published, that's what it is. I have tried to ask many brothers and sisters to become authors. Maybe it's not for everybody. Maybe some will gravitate to it. Maybe I'm not the one to be the one to influence you. Might be somebody else. Who knows? But what I am saying, brothers and sisters, is that we want to point out, brothers and sisters, concerning the matter of our people in this particular case. Some of the names that we will be going over are familiar to some, and some of the names that we will be going over are not familiar to some. Nonetheless, brothers and sisters, we still definitely want to go over a particular matter. The majority of the people taken as slaves, brothers and sisters, did not come to what we call the United States of today. The majority, brothers and sisters, went to Brazil and South America. Then the next major drop off, if you will, was to the Caribbean. And then 6% or so to what we call the United States of today. The United States legally did not exist until, say, 1776. So, with that, brothers and sisters, being the case, we want to point out, if we will, that the first nation really to involve itself in the slave trade, brothers and sisters, was people who were the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, the British, aka the English. And what happened, brothers and sisters, in many of those cases, right? For those who do know that particular history, if we will, right? We know good and well, brothers and sisters, they bartered one with another and debated one with another, went to war one with another. It seems, brothers and sisters, that in many, many cases, what many people attempted to do was, as stated, to try to get the black man to not talk about the situation that he, she, the people itself were involved in being enslaved. I want to read something from this book here called From Slavery to Freedom. This is a college reference book. And on page 73, we read the following. Almost 30 years later, in 1741, there was a rumor of an even larger insurrection. After a series of fires, the rumor spread that blacks and poor whites were conspiring to destroy law and order in the city and to seize control. After the city offered generous rewards for the apprehension of the conspirators, almost 200 whites and blacks were arrested and prosecuted. At least 100 blacks were convicted, 18 of whom were hanged, 13 burned alive, and 70 banished. 4 whites, including 2 women, were hanged. No more serious outbursts took place during the colonial period, and by the time of the Revolution, New York had begun to recognize the moral and economic undesirability of holding human beings as in bondage. Brothers and sisters, we do know that places such as New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Maryland, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and even Florida were slave states. Louisiana being a slave state. Those who are familiar with American history and slavery is what we want to sit there and talk about in this particular case. Brothers and sisters, I want to read a source concerning this kind of subject matter, if we will. All right. And concerning the matter of slavery and our people, right? So we could gain some understanding of what we're talking about. In 1441, the slave trade started by the workers of Henry the Navigator. In 1455 and 1456, the Portuguese were dealing in slaves in what is now Sierra Leone and Guinea. Basil Davison, in his book, A History of West Africa, points out that the slave trade went north from Africa to Portugal and Spain. Then, in the time of Columbus, natives were shipped from the Caribbean to Europe. The book Black Indians by William Katz explains such. The author Eric Williams, in his book Documents of West Indian History, points that out also. The first slave ship going to the west was in 1518, according to Basil Davison. This was during the trade under the Asiento, in which the King of Spain, Charles V, granted slavery to the Spaniards to be done in places now called Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Many scholars attempt to separate the European nations involved in the slave trade as Portuguese, Dutch, Danes, French, Spaniard, English, and Swedish. Yet, in 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas between Spain and Portugal, the American and Spain Treaty of 1795, the Asiento between the Spanish, English, and French show that they were different European nations involved in the European aspect of the slave trade, yet they were all the same mentally as well. So, brothers and sisters, what we just read, if we will, came from this book here. The book that I wrote and released, Thank the Most High. All right, that is part of chapter 1 that I just read out of the book there, if we will. Brothers and sisters, that book is available for those who want it online. I want to say a shout out and shalom to the brother Black Av. Thank you, my brother. Shalom. So, in this presentation, slavery, 1600 to 1900, and we're going to speak in part about the 1619 date. What made, brothers and sisters, the guy be comfortable to go to John Wolfe and give him and sell 20 odd Negroes? What made brothers and sisters, George Yardley, who died in 1627, to be comfortable, even receiving of the 20 that was brought to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, he got 15 of them. So, in a nutshell, basically, John Wolfe was left with 5. So, did slavery already exist in colonial America prior to the time of the people being brought there in 1619? Yes, brothers and sisters. You had the situations with the governor of Massachusetts and Connecticut, if you will. You had the situation, brothers and sisters, with the lieutenant governors of such places, such as George Calvert, who was a part of that between the matter between Massachusetts and Connecticut in the slave trade. So that's what we want to talk about in reference with such. We want to go over, brothers and sisters, and talk about a couple of pictures, if you will, right? Now, this here is the guy, a picture of Robert Rich. In the 1620s, he became in part known as the Duke of York, if you will. And he was involved in the slave trade and what lands became later on known as the United States. All right. So now, for slavery to be dated from the era of 1619, and in 1624, this man, already grown in age or so, to already been a big merchant in it, means good and well, brothers and sisters. By the way, his name is Robert Rich, as stated, that the slave trade in what we call the United States was already in fruition. Because there's no way that Dutch men of war is going to be comfortable to just say, hey, there's some 20 Negroes. They was already involved in that said trade, if we will. Brothers and sisters, another picture that we want to talk about for edification purposes is this guy here. This is James Hammond. All right. We're going to read about him as we go along in this presentation regarding him and slavery. All right. This here is the picture that they tell us is Anthony Johnson. Brothers and sisters, this is not Anthony Johnson. This is truly Lewis Hayden in the 1800s. But they post this picture of a black man saying that he is Anthony Johnson. Maybe because they figure we won't read and most definitely don't figure us to write books. Brothers and sisters, they say that Anthony Johnson was the pioneer of American slavery, which we will be discussing. Such is not the case, brothers and sisters. All right. This, brothers and sisters, if we will, is George McDuffie. He was the governor, brothers and sisters, of South Carolina in the 1800s. We're going to be talking in part about him and his aspect and role in the slave trade of our people in what we call the United States. This here is George Washington. Now, he is or was the first president of the United States. The presidents before him were the presidents of the Continental Congress, not the United States. We want to emphasize that. So, brothers and sisters, in the book that I wrote here, I explained the difference between the Continental Congress presidents and the United States presidents. All right, that book too is available online for those who want it. So we just want to point that out. So George Washington was not the ninth president of the United States. He was the first president of the United States. But if the Continental Congress was still in office during his era, then he would have been the ninth. So we just want to point that out in that particular case. Brothers and sisters, we're going to in part talk about this gentleman as well. This is Woodrow Wilson. He was the person who was the president of the United States during the era when many lynchings was going on concerning us as black people. We are going to in part talk about him as well. So we just want to give like an intro of what we're going to be discussing and what we're going to be talking about. Last night, thankful to the Most High, did a presentation called From Kemet to Compton and went over the pictures of the people being enslaved in the land of Egypt and the diaspora of the Israelites and bringing it down into today's day and time, if we will. I want to, brothers and sisters, go back briefly to that. Just a picture of it, if we will, right? Thank you again for the time. And here's the picture that I want to show for edification and reasoning purposes. Rome coming against the Israelites here. An enemy stronger than the Israelites made the Israelites flee south. The Israelites did not run north, knowing that the enemy that's stronger than them is coming from the north. The Israelites ran south aspect and then west aspect, if we will. Brothers and sisters, from that diaspora in part, because that's not the main, pardon me, that is the main, but that's not the only diaspora of the Israelites. We have to, in part, look maybe into a spiritual eye. Where the children of Israel were, so did many of their customs. So did many of, as it says in the sad case of Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter, where it says that these plagues shall pursue and overtake you. That's exactly what happened with the children of Israel. So, brothers and sisters, in this particular case, we want to read regarding, in part, the enslavement of our people and so forth. James Henry Hammond. All right. And we want to show the picture as we did earlier of whom we're talking about when we say James Henry Hammond. All right. And the pictures that's here. That's whom we're talking about right here. And I'm gonna have to ask you to brace yourself for what we're going to be reading. Right? Who was a strong supporter of slavery and a Democrat, stated the following. In all social systems, there must be a class to do menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. You dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares make war on it. Cotton is king. He had a slave plantation in South Carolina named Radcliffe. This Democrat had a policy on how the captives should be treated. Following is an example of such. It goes on to say, the children are to be given a blanket every 3 years. The boys and girls are to be given 2 shirts for fall or autumn and 2 shirts for the spring. This means each year, each child gets 4 shirts. Women who were nursing were told to go to the field at sunrise. They were to nurse their children for 45 minutes each, 3 times a day. During the 13th month of the baby's life, they were nursed at noontime only. So that means that once the baby turned 1 in a month, in this particular case, they were only allowed to be nursed at noontime only. The captives were awakened an hour before daylight. And when daylight came, the overseer was to make sure the captives were out of the house and in the fields. Marriage can only be with the people on the plantation of the same slave master. If one married a captive from another slave master's plantation, the guilty was to be whipped with 100 stripes. Church was on Sundays. Any praying and singing had to be with the permission of the overseer or slave master. Now, brothers and sisters, one of the things we want to emphasize on about that is that it distinctly says that praying and singing is only to be done with the permission of the overseer or the slave master. One of the things I've come to learn in studying about slavery, when I turn to the side, I'm drinking. I don't want to do it on the camera. Sorry. One of the things I've come to learn about studying slavery and so forth and so on is that even the nice, if you will, slave masters did not allow their slaves to learn to read. Not one. In all the studies that I've done, was a slave master ever been noted for allowing the slaves to know how to read or write. That was a crime. People who were black and free during that era of enslavement of black people still were not allowed to know how to read. And brothers and sisters, if there were any black people who knew how to read and taught another black person, in many cases, they would have been killed. So what were they trying to that great extent to hide from people once it came down to that? What great extent, brothers and sisters, were they trying to sit there and have the people not become aware of by saying it is a crime to be taught how to read? In the 1977 or so movie Roots, there was a question that was asked even in that movie. Now, to show you, and I say this in no disrespect, how many people regarding our enslavement in the United States, I don't want to use the word controlled, but who are minimalists, if you will. Soon as you mention the movie Roots, it's like Alex Haley stole it. That is a political matter between Alex Haley and so forth and so on. The events that happen that the movie display is not made up. Brothers and sisters, we are going to continue to expose and bring out the fact of what happened with our ancestors. Everybody else does it. Everybody else is encouraged to do so. You understand? But when it comes down to our people, it seems in certain cases there are, well, what about those over there? What about those over there? That distraction is not going to keep on working, brothers and sisters. When you say that the Cherokee Indians, who did also enslave the black man, and when you read about the slave insurrection in 1842, all right, against the Cherokee slave masters, brothers and sisters, um, there's no way in the world that, well, they were just encouraged to do so. But if you was encouraged to enslave me, then both you and your encourager are my problem. I'm not going to look past, brothers and sisters, what influenced you to do wrong to me. That pacified spirit is not going to continue to be among us as a people, if you will. You understand? So we want to continue, if we will, brothers and sisters, in this case. Slaves were not allowed to grow cotton for themselves. George McDuffie in 1835 made a speech regarding the natural state of the Negro. He says, "No human institution, in my opinion, is more manifestly consistent with the will of said God than domestic slavery, and no one of his ordinances is written in more legible characters than which cosigns the African race to his condition, as more conductive to their own happiness than any other of which they are susceptible." Goes on to say, brothers and sisters, we were just reading about what George McDuffie in the 1830s stated. And we want to, again, brothers and sisters, point out what and who we was talking about for reason and purposes. All right. Yeah. So you can see who he's talking about. Now, regarding this said picture here, if we will, right? This is who they attempt to state is Anthony Johnson. Anthony Johnson in reality did not look like that because the people in the 17th century or the 1600s did not dress like that, if we will. They want to portray that the black man is the pioneer of American slavery in order to distract the fact of said Robert Rich, of said George Yardley, of said Lieutenant Governor Calvert. These are things we want to point out that's just in basic and simple history books. All right, let us read. Where did they get this picture from? This is dated to the era of the 1650s, but it was not until the 1820s that pictures were taken with cameras, and it was first notably done by the guy Will Harrison in the 1840s with John Quincy Adams, the grandson of the second president, John Adams. So we asking brothers and sisters, where did this picture come from? All right, when this right here is a guy truly named Lewis Hayden. Okay, let's go on. From Washington to Monroe, their images were made in sculptures or paintings. Who painted the image that we see here of this Johnson, quote unquote Johnson? Washington. Now, when we say Washington, brothers and sisters, we want to emphasize whom we're speaking of in this particular case is this guy here. All right. When we say Washington, to further notice, this is whom we're talking about. All right. Goes on to say this. From Washington to Monroe, their images were made in sculptures or paintings. Who painted the image we see of this Johnson? Washington had slaves since age 11 in 1743, and Andrew Jackson, who had the issue with the Supreme Court concerning the Trail of Tears, had slaves, he being the seventh president. Jefferson, the third president, had slaves. Johnson, the successor of Lincoln, who was the 17th president, had slaves. Lincoln, who was the 16th president, had over 200 Native Americans lynched, pardon me, had over 20 Native Americans lynched in one day. Lincoln fired the guy Fremont who freed the slaves in Missouri. So these are things we want to emphasize on. While they're trying to embellish, if we will, the history of what happened with the United States, right? By saying, oh, okay, they'll show you a picture of Lewis Hayden, right? And then sit there and tell you and I, if we will, that Lincoln freed slaves. This is supposed to be Anthony Johnson. Lincoln did not free slaves. Lincoln was assassinated, brothers and sisters, in April of 1865. You ever heard of what they call Juneteenth? All right. Can I get a one or two? All right. One or two from anyone who heard of Juneteenth. All right. That was the said timing of black people to been free in 1865 in what we call the United States. If Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865, how could we as black people be told that our freedom date in the United States is during the era of Juneteenth? It's because Lincoln did not free slaves. That's why. George Washington brothers and sisters, freed his slaves on his deathbed. So not trying to be funny. In other words, I got everything I could from these slaves of mine. Um, Now that I'm dying, boom, okay, I free you. You understand? Brothers and sisters, that is the kind of pacifist spirit that we are now being fed regarding our enslavement in this society. This is not, brothers and sisters, on the other hand, to play judgment or profit, if you will. But no society that has been established with bloodshed will thrive. Lincoln, for what he's worth, stated that for every soldier that fell in the Civil War was the result of every lash that was given to a slave. I want to emphasize that again. All right. Lincoln stated in one of his last speeches that for every soldier that was killed in the Civil War, right, was the result of what happened of people getting lashes during slavery. Brothers and sisters, while trying to say, as many do online, that this guy here is the pioneer of American slavery, there is a Caucasian guy on YouTube, and he presented that. And I asked some of the questions in the comment section, which seems I've never gotten an answer about, and probably may not get an answer to. So whether they want to present that, we're going to present our information that can be verified and checked out. All right, let's go on. Queen Isabel and Martin Van Buren were both in agreement that blacks should be enslaved. Martin Van Buren had a slave, by the way. He was the 8th president of the United States. President Wilson in the White House. We want to show who we're talking about. All right. This guy right here, if we will, is President Woodrow Wilson. We want to show whom we're speaking of. All right. And it says this: President Wilson in the White House sold the KKK as, quote, good Americans. Brothers and sisters, the president that is in the United States of today, with the situation, say, with Charlottesville in Virginia, when someone was actually killed, Trump said there were good people on, quote, both sides. He said concerning the people who stormed the Capitol last week, we love you. I don't know who the we is that he's talking about, but he definitely is not going to disavow his supporters. Same thing as was done, brothers and sisters, with President Woodrow Wilson, if we will. All right. In the era of Roosevelt, a black woman was not allowed to sing in the White House. So they showed the lady singing outside the house. President Buchanan, who sided with the South area in slavery, he was the 15th president. Lincoln did not want slavery to expand. Lincoln also did not want it to be eradicated totally. So, brothers and sisters, we want to point out, did not want slavery to expand. He was not for helping black people. Okay? Robert Rich in 1624 had blacks as slaves in Virginia. He became the Earl of Warwick. The first thing is that American slavery was a white thing imposed on black people after it was imposed on natives in the Western Hemisphere. There were blacks as slaves in 1565 in St. Augustine, Florida. But the meme that we see right here, or this picture that is said to be of Anthony Johnson, they're going to tell us, brothers and sisters, in the 1650s that Anthony Johnson is the pioneer of American slavery. Yet we know that from 1565 in Florida, slavery existed. Now, what some may say is that Florida was not a state until 1845. But yet, at the same token, with the era of Anthony Johnson, there were no states, there was colonies, if you will. Florida was never part of the 13 colonies. But brothers and sisters, Florida at that time was operated and owned by the Spanish, as was Louisiana. So one of the things we want to point out is that they attempt to, as I read out of the book that I wrote, to separate, okay, this is Spain, Portugal, Dutch, English, French. You all were in cahoots and doing the same aspect as enslaving the people brought from Western Africa. So these are things, brothers and sisters, that we want to go over and talk about, if we will. All right. It was the English leader John Hawkins who helped England have slaves in the Caribbean. He entered the slave trade in 1562. He worked for Elizabeth I, who was born in 1533, the daughter of Henry VIII. Okay, so you have brothers and sisters. We want to write this in. John Hawkins. John Hawkins died, brothers and sisters, in the 1590s. He had black people as slaves in Venezuela, Dominican Republic, and so forth. When we speak, brothers and sisters, about North America, we want to point out that the Caribbean is included in that. Trinidad is part of North America. It's not part of the United States, but it is part of North America. Okay? So let us continue in this case here. In the book, The Negro in the United States, by Edward Fraser, we see it appears from the scanty information available that the Bible was used to impress the Negroes that they, as the Israelites, could throw off the yoke of slavery and that God would come to their aid. Olou Uda Equiano and Igbo, which is from out of Nigeria, stressed the similarities between the Old Testament Jews and those of his own people. Like the Israelites in a primitive state, our government was conducted by our chiefs or judges, our wise men and elders, and the head of the family with us enjoyed a similar authority over his household, with that which is described to Abraham and the other patriarchs. The law of retaliation obtained almost universally with us, as with them, and even their religion appeared to have shed us a ray of his glory. For we had our circumcision, we had our sacrifices and burnt offerings, our washings and purifications, and on the same occasions as they did. Oluda Equiano was a person that was taken in the 1700s as a captive and slaves to what we call the place of Virginia today. As it states there, it states that he emphasized having known how to read, correct me if I'm wrong, Nat Turner, knowing how to read. Gabriel Prosser, knowing how to read. Denmark Vesey, knowing how to read. So knowing how to read became a problem to the enslaver. Knowing how to read became a problem to the slave master. So even, quote, as one begins to study more and more regarding the Atlantic slave trade and what happened, right? We have it to where the nice, even quote unquote, slave masters did not allow their said slaves to know how to read. Brothers and sisters, reading is something that we want to impress and respect to our people. And this is not trying to play salesman, but here is something for those interested if you care to read. Can get this book online. Deuteronomy 28:15-68. History Untold to the Masses. We read part of this book earlier. This book is available for $15 online. With this said pandemic, I lowered the price of the books. All right. And so forth. Here, Israelite history as it relates to the world. This book too is available online. And as you can see from the pictures, it goes from the Assyrian aspect, the Greek, America, touching about Israel in Africa, and what happened with the Persians. So it's like world history and involving the Israelites in that particular case. This book, as stated in other presentations, I feel honestly is my best book. I must give my opinion on it, if so. All right. This book is called From Assyria to America. The 12 tribes are in derision. And brothers and sisters, here is part of what we were talking about. The movement, even by some quote black people that want to say the Atlantic slave trade is incorrect and that the Atlantic slave trade is told in reverse. Brothers and sisters, before the said autonomous or aboriginal group of people came in to be talking on social media or so, that knowledge of the slave ships that went east was already known. You had the guy Ivan Sertima who wrote about that in the 1970s. You had the guy Eric Williams. He passed away, may he rest in peace, in 1981. He wrote about that in the 70s and the 1960s. So that information of people going or being taken from the Caribbean or North America or the said United States as time went on to the Western to the Eastern Hemisphere is not new knowledge. What happened, it appears, is that people began to just deal with online scholarship. And I say this in no disrespect, where one may not have to go in and dig for reference materials and so forth and so on. And without fact checking something, just go along and say, oh, okay, well, then that has to be true because it sounds nice. We have been, as Malcolm X stated, if you take a apple so far from its tree, and then if I'm paraphrasing correctly on Malcolm X, to try to bring it back, it's going to look strange to it. And that's what it is with us. They called our records the Old Testament, brothers and sisters. They gave us, as my first Israelite teacher stated, who they refer to as Jesus Christ, in Hebrew as Yeshua, who, by all accounts, if even if you read in the New Testament, would have been an Israelite, and what the Europeans did was take your brother and made him your God. You understand? So by giving you Christianity, brothers and sisters, by giving you the aspect of saying the part that the Most High spoken in the Bible is the Old Testament, if you will, by sitting up there and giving pictures of one black man by the name of Lewis Hayden, and then saying it's Anthony Johnson, then saying in the 1650s, Anthony Johnson was the pioneer of American slavery, without realizing about the situation. If we will, just pick one picture of this. About this guy here, Robert Rich, who dates back to the 1620s. Brothers and sisters, that is why it is important to sit there and read, study, gather your notes. We're going to close out. I'm going to leave my contact info, 908 587 4841. All right. And my email and my website. nightpublications.com. Brothers and sisters, thank you for participating and watching, sharing, liking, and for those who will leave comments, to leave comments concerning this presentation. And for the other presentations that was done on this channel throughout the course of this weekend. There will be a hiatus or a sabbatical of doing presentations on this channel on a weekend, besides maybe a Hebrew class here or there, because I want to use the time on a weekend, namely quote, Saturday night, Sunday, and Sunday night, quote, to get more books together. Thankful to the Most High, I now have written and published 11 books. I'm working on a 12th book currently, brothers and sisters. That book is called Slavery, 1619, The Cherished Date. And in it, we want to talk about the aspect of what happened with Spain and Portugal and how they influenced, if you want to talk about somebody influence somebody to oppress one, how they influenced the French and the Spanish and so forth and so on. Pardon me, the French and the English and so forth and so on. All right. So, brothers and sisters, in closing this out, I want to state again, thank you for the support to the people who have patronized and bought the book or the books. I want to say, may the Most High bless you for the donations for those who have given it. If so, if you care to, that is $ Frank Son One is the Cash App. All right. So, if we will, brothers and sisters, as stated, there will be, besides a Hebrew class here and there, a break on me doing the history presentations because I want to spend the free time to be able to sit there and get the next book out for publishing purposes. All right. Feel free to call or text me at, as stated, 908-587-4841. All right. Most I bless. Shalom, brothers and sisters.